Good morning to the folks who are joining us. We have a question on the screen for you. Please go ahead and put your answer in the chat. Feel free to introduce yourself. Let us know where you're joining from today. Really looking forward to the conversation today. See lots of Frans and Floyds and Florences in the chat. The F storms tend to not treat us very well here in North Carolina. Hugo.
Yeah, bring a chair.
Okay, well, we're at 11:01 and people are still joining us, but we have a lot of ground to cover today. As many of you probably saw in the headlines this morning and last night that it's forecasted to be a very active Atlantic hurricane season. And my name is Dr. Kathy Dello. I'm the state climatologist of North Carolina, and I'm also the director of the State Climate Office. And about a month ago, I was walking into meetings and folks were saying to me, Kathy, what's up with hurricane season? What's up with hurricane season? And I decided to bring in two of my colleagues and experts to talk to you a little bit more about what we expect for this season. So I lost my screen. Corey Davis is our assistant state climatologist here at the North Carolina State Climate Office. He is truly a North Carolina weather and climate expert. He knows the ins and outs of our storms and can provide a lot of the historical context. So he's going to start off with that. And our neighbor upstairs at the State Climate Office, Nick Petro, he's the warning coordination meteorologist at the National Weather Service in Raleigh. We're really fortunate to have him and his expertise here today, and he'll talk a little bit more about the outlook and the forecast and some preparedness tips. Next slide. So some logistics, go ahead and mute yourself and turn off your video. We're just in listen mode right now. We have about 45 minutes of content for you. It is a jammed-packed session, but we've left you with a lot of time for Q&A at the end. So if you think of a question, just go ahead and type it in the chat. We're going to send a blog post summary this afternoon, and we're also going to post the link to this video on our YouTube page, and that will be in the blog post. And then the brief commercial of the State Climate Office. We're based here at NC State University. I'm here on Centennial Campus right now. And we connect North Carolinians with climate data and knowledge, much like we're doing today. North Carolina is really fortunate to have one of the largest state climate offices in the country. We have 13 full-time staff and 6 students, and we truly do try to touch all 100 counties. So we are out there working on research, extension, outreach, and monitoring. And one of the ways we monitor North Carolina's environment is through the North Carolina EcoNet. We have 44 research grade weather stations across the state, with 3 to come in the next year. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Corey. Corey, take it away.
All right, thanks, Kathy. Appreciate the introduction. Again, I'll be getting us started this morning with some background about hurricane season climatology, beginning with really when and where and why we tend to see storms forming in the Atlantic, because understanding those factors and those environmental ingredients will help us to see why we're expecting even more activity this year here in 2024. So if we start off at a global level and look at where historically tropical storms have tended to form and tended to move, not surprisingly, these are over the ocean regions. We can call these storms different things depending on where they are. In the southern hemisphere, these tend to be cyclones. Here in the Western Pacific, the stronger storms are typhoons. And then in the Eastern Pacific and here in the Atlantic, of course, we know these are hurricanes that we're talking about when they get to their strongest stage. But no matter where they form, they have some things in common. Again, they're forming over the oceans, but especially over warm water. And that's because these storms are extracting heat energy from the ocean, and they're using that to fuel themselves and to grow and to strengthen. Well, we also notice that these storms are not forming right along the equator. They rely on spin to really keep their energy up. So we're not going to see these storms at the equator, but on either side of that, we get into these tropical regions, and that's where we see more of those existing disturbances. Sometimes we hear about tropical waves that end up becoming our tropical storms and hurricanes. And when you look and see where you're seeing storms most often, where the density is the highest, of course, there's a lot in the Western Pacific. But pound for pound, or maybe square mile for square mile, we have a lot in the Atlantic as well. One big reason for that is that we see fairly warm ocean currents across the region. There's an equatorial current that goes from the coast of Africa toward the Caribbean. And then we all know the warm Gulf Stream that goes just off our southeast coastline. All those currents are helping to supply that warm water to the storms that are forming and moving through those regions. Another really important factor is what's going on not just at the surface, but at the upper levels of the atmosphere. We want to have fairly light upper level winds for these storms to be able to form, because if you're in a region with very strong upper level winds, that can really tear these storms apart. We'd call that wind shear in the atmosphere. You can think about this like setting up a house of cards and then blowing on the top. Well, it's not going to stay standing very long if you're blowing on those top parts. So you can see down across the South Atlantic, for instance, that's a region where the ocean tends to be fairly warm, but the upper level winds are so strong in that region, it's just not very suitable for storm formation. And then you look over the Atlantic, again, fairly light upper level winds for the most part. That can change sometime during the season, but again, all in all, tends to be a fairly favorable region for storm development. So looking at when in the season those factors tend to be the most favorable, with the sea surface temperatures across the entire North Atlantic, you see right now we're here at the end of May, just about to go into June. This is that time of the year when the Atlantic, the ocean surface is warming the fastest. We're really getting into that summer warming where over the next 2 to 3 months, we will get to the hottest sea surface temperatures of the season. Those tend to happen anywhere from mid-August on through mid-September. If you've gone down to the beach on Labor Day weekend, I'm sure you've noticed the water still tends to be pretty warm then. The ocean is usually warm enough to swim in pretty comfortably. So that's usually around the warmest time of the year for the ocean surface. And then as we go to the next slide here, it's probably not too surprising that that's when we tend to see the most activity in the Atlantic. When we talk about the peak of the season, that's usually sometime in early to mid-September. And historically, that has been when we've seen the most tropical storm and hurricane activity in the Atlantic. Again, looking at where we are now, we're here at the end of May going into June. This is when we sometimes start to see a slight increase in activity. It is not unusual to see storms form in May, even though the official start of the season isn't until June the 1st. But really, over the next month to month and a half until the beginning of July, we don't tend to see a huge increase in activity, just kind of keeping at a fairly low level. And then once we're in mid-July and especially early August, that's when historically that activity has really started to ramp up again in association with those warmer sea surface temperatures across the ocean. And it goes in the opposite direction at the end of the season. After that peak in September, we tend to see activity slowly decrease over the next couple months. And then, as we'll talk about in just a minute, by the time we get to October and November, it's not unusual to see storms that time of the year, but they tend to happen a little bit less often, typically. So now we can look at what a typical season looks like in the Atlantic and also compare that to what some of the most active seasons on record have looked like. So over this 30-year period from 1991 to 2020, we use that 30-year period because it gives us a good representation of our current or our recent climate. These are what the numbers look like for the Atlantic. Every year we average 14 named storms, with half of those becoming hurricanes and 3 of those becoming major hurricanes, which is at a category 3 or above on the Saffir-Simpson scale. So again, that's what maybe an average season would look like. But what do our strongest seasons look like? Well, first off, we can look at 2005. This is a year that I remember very well because it was my freshman year at NC State in the meteorology program. I had always been really interested by hurricanes. But that year we had so much activity, including storms like Katrina. We were able to look at more data, more satellite imagery than I ever expected were available for these storms. So a really interesting semester and definitely got me hooked on meteorology, just watching that hurricane season play out. But you look at the numbers, and we had basically double those averages. We had 28 named storms, 15 hurricanes, and 7 major hurricanes. And again, storms like Katrina and Wilma, those were among the major hurricanes that we saw during that 2005 season. We skip ahead a little bit. We get to 2020, an even more active season. A lot of folks, I'm sure, will remember this one. In total, we had 30 named storms that year. Again, double the average historically of the number of hurricanes with 14, and another season with 7 major hurricanes that year. And then 1 year later, the numbers are a little bit lower, but still an active season in 2021 with 21 named storms, and then closer to those historical averages with 7 hurricanes and 4 major hurricanes. So I share this both to show what an average season looks like, but also what those benchmarks are for the most active seasons on record. And again, some of the forecasts are telling us that we could be somewhere in this range for the number of named storms and the number of hurricanes here in 2024. There are other seasons we could add on this list as well. Just last year in 2023, there were 20 total tropical storms. So that was another very active season. And I'll have a slide in a minute that shows how we're comparing, at least in terms of sea surface temperatures, with where we were last year. So let's talk about how the activity tends to look and progress throughout the season. This will also give you a feel for some of the milestones to watch for in terms of when we might get to a certain level of activity. So again, we're still in the early season right now, end of May, into June, and even July. The map on the right here shows historically where storms have tended to form at this time of the year. The most common areas are down across the Gulf of Mexico, and then right over the Gulf Stream, again, that warm ocean current that goes just off our coastline. These do tend to be the warmest parts of the Atlantic this early in the season, but the activity tends to be pretty hit or miss this time of the year. There are some years where the water across the main development region in the Atlantic is just not all that warm yet. Of course, that's not really a problem this year, but also there can be years where we have more wind shear early in the season, and that tends to hold back activity. We've even had years where there's dust that blows off the Sahara Desert over the Atlantic. That saps a lot of the moisture in the atmosphere and keeps storms from forming this early in the season. So, on average, historically, the first named storm has formed on June the 20th. In our more active seasons like 2021 and last year, we have seen more storms forming this early. We've had up to 3 named storms in the month of June. And again, that first kind of milestone to watch for is how many storms have formed through the end of July. The record was set back in 2020. We had 9 named storms by the end of July. And the last one of those storms that formed was Hurricane Isaias. That went on to affect us here in North Carolina at the beginning of August. Again, we've already seen this with the graphs that we looked at, but the peak of the season really tends to happen in August and September. That's when we're seeing the most activity. Historically, early August is when we tend to see our 3rd named storm. But like we've seen in some of those very active seasons, we can be well ahead of that pace. In fact, we've been able to get past that historical average for the entire season of 14 named storms at the beginning of September. 2020, we had our 14th named storm on September the 1st. In 2005, we had that 14th storm on September the 5th. So that just gives you a sense of how active those seasons were. We hadn't even got to the true peak of the season yet, and we were already past the annual average total for the number of storms. For the month of September, another number to keep in mind is 10 total storms in that month. That was also back in 2020 when we had that level of activity. And you'll note that by that point at the end of September in 2020, we had exhausted the normal list of 21 storm names. We were already on the Greek alphabet. And I'll talk a little bit later about what that contingency plan looks like now in case we were to run out of names on the standard list. But on the map here, you can see that activity tends to be pretty widespread across the region. This is that time of the year when we'll start to see storms take shape pretty much as soon as they move off the west coast of Africa. A lot of times we'll call these Cape Verde type storms because they'll form near the Cape Verde Islands. And then you'll see just like a conveyor belt moving westward across the Atlantic and then either into the Caribbean and the Gulf, or then sometimes up and close to the east coastline. Storms like Fran, storms like Floyd are really good examples of those types of systems that we can see here near the peak of the season. And then later on in the season, we know that by October and November, our air temperatures start to cool off. Well, the ocean temperatures also start to cool off at this time of the year. So usually we don't tend to see quite as much activity this late in the season. The most favorable areas for storm formation are down in the Caribbean, over the Bahamas, near the southern stretches of the Gulf Stream, and then also out across parts of the central Atlantic, where the water can stay pretty warm. If you think about a storm like Hurricane Matthew back in 2016, it formed down over the Caribbean, came up through the Bahamas as a Category 4, and then paralleled our coastline as it continued moving farther north. So again, we don't tend to see quite as much activity this late in the season. On average, 2 hurricanes tend to form in October and November. This is also a time of the year where it can be really hit or miss. Last year was a case where even though it was an active season overall, once we got to the end of October, there were no more storms that formed. The last storm, which was Tammy, dissipated on October the 28th. On the other hand, a year like 2020 still had some pretty steady activity in November. There were 3 named storms that month, one of which was Hurricane Ada. We actually had some impacts from that here in North Carolina. That storm stayed over Florida, but it provided a lot of moisture ahead of a cold front that was moving through. So we had some pretty heavy rain and some localized flooding across the state that month, which capped off again that very active 2020 hurricane season. So we've talked about the numbers behind some of those recent active years. Well, let's talk about what those looked like here in North Carolina. First, going back to that record-setting 2020 season, again, 30 total named storms that year. The one that made landfall in North Carolina was Hurricane Isaias. We can pick out its track coming over the Bahamas, right off the coast of Florida, and then straight up into southeastern North Carolina. But despite all the other storms we had that year, there were no other landfalls in North Carolina. But that's not to say that there were no impacts the rest of the season. Instead, what we saw was all these storms that either formed in or moved over the Gulf of Mexico ended up seeing their remnants curving back off to the east. And those remnant storms is where we saw a lot of our impact that season, especially in the western part of the state. There were storms like Sally and Beta and Zeta that year, again, getting into the Greek alphabet, that dropped quite a bit of rain and had some pretty significant damage out across that part of the state. Going 1 year later into 2021, there were 3 storms that year that affected North Carolina, and none of those were landfalls. These were also systems that originally made landfall along the Gulf of Mexico and then moved across North Carolina. In June that year, we had Tropical Storm Claudette. In July, we had Tropical Storm Elsa. And then probably the most memorable of the 3 that season was Tropical Storm Fred. It made landfall along the Florida Panhandle. The remnants moved up across the western part of the state. Again, only a tropical storm, but it produced some really extreme rainfall totals in the mountains. Parts of western North Carolina had more than 15 inches of rain over a 5-day period, including some storms the weekend before Fred came through. And that produced some really severe flooding, especially in Haywood County along the Pigeon River, that unfortunately resulted in several fatalities in that part of the state. And then finally, we'll come to last year, a really interesting hurricane season overall. For one, we talked about how the activity really shut off at the end of October, but before that, we had a lot of storms active in the Atlantic. However, not very much of that activity affected the continental US. We had one storm in Idalia that came in through the Gulf and soaked parts of eastern North Carolina. We had Tropical Storm Ophelia that came up through the eastern part of the state, but only one other storm that season made landfall in the continental US. That was Harold down in South Texas. Everything else that season stayed offshore. It stayed out to sea. So a lot of storms overall, not that many impacts here on our part of the country. A good reminder that an active hurricane season does not necessarily mean it'll be an impactful one locally, but by the same token, it only takes one storm in your area to make it a very impactful and a very memorable season where you're at. So looking at what some of those recent storms have done in North Carolina, again, we had 2 last year. At the end of August, Tropical Storm Idalia moved through. It was a pretty weak, pretty fast-moving storm overall, so we wouldn't expect much impact, but it packed quite a punch. It brought a lot of rain. More than 8 inches of rain fell in the Whiteville area, and you see this drone photo on the left here This shows the flooding after Idalia in Whiteville. So this is not what we would normally expect from a tropical storm. This is what we would expect from a hurricane like Florence or Matthew or Floyd. But just goes to show again how an unsuspecting storm can create some pretty significant impacts. And then in September, we had Tropical Storm Ophelia came through the eastern part of the state. Between the rain and the winds and the storm surge from that system, we did have some flooding right along the coast in towns like Newbern and Little Washington. And you see the photo here of some of the inundation there right along the river. But in terms of landfalling hurricanes in North Carolina, we've got to go back a ways to find one. The most recent one was Isaias in 2020. Again, it caused some flooding, some overwash down at the southern coast. Prior to that, in 2019, Hurricane Dorian moved through. It was a pretty damaging storm along the Outer Banks, like you see here. But we are now going on 4 years since our last landfalling hurricane in North Carolina. And historically, we've tended to see a landfalling hurricane every 4 to 5 years. So I hate to use the phrase we're overdue, but the numbers do tell us that about a 4 year gap between hurricanes is pretty typical historically. So again, never let your guard down, but especially when we've had a gap of a few years like this, it's always a good reminder that these storms can and do affect North Carolina. So let's talk a little bit about this year. I know Nick will cover more on the outlook in his section, but wanted to begin with some perspective about just how warm these sea surface temperatures are now. We looked at this chart earlier that shows that trend throughout the season of warming through the summer months until the peak of the season. Well, I'll now add in this orange line, which shows what those North Atlantic sea surface temperatures looked like in 2023. And you can see, especially beginning here in May on through the peak of the season, just how much warmer the water was last year, especially by late July and then August and early September. That's a big reason for that flurry of activity that we had at that point in the season last year. So you might wonder, well, where do things stand here in 2024? Well, this black line shows where we are here through the end of May. The really crazy part about this is at the end of winter, early spring of this year, just how much warmer than those historical average conditions we had been. Frankly, the Atlantic never just cooled down as much in the off season as we would typically see. And here in May, we're still running at or ahead of the pace from last year. And you can see based on these historical years, things don't tend to back off much between here and the peak of the season. We still expect pretty steady warming from here through August or September. So if that keeps up, then you can imagine we will even be ahead of that warm pace that we set just last year. So again, that's one big reason why we were expecting so much activity across the Atlantic this summer. So one thing that I'm sure will be on folks' minds is what are we going to call all these storms this year? Well, this is the list of storm names for 2024. These are curated by the World Meteorological Organization. They have several lists of names that they'll rotate through every 6 years. And then if a storm is bad enough, if it's damaging enough, then they can retire a name from the list. But a lot of these names will look pretty familiar because they've come up time and time again every 6 years, especially some of the ones early in the alphabet. These early season storms usually don't tend to be all that strong or all that damaging, so we'll go through those storms a lot. Alberto is a storm that we see quite a bit. There's been at least half a dozen Albertos that I can remember. And one of those is probably memorable for some folks in North Carolina. In 2012, the first storm of that season formed right off the Carolina coastline, pretty much just sat there and spun its wheels for a few days. So we had some rain, we had some wind from that storm. Not too much damage, but again, it is a name that folks may recall from having Albertos before this one. Another name like that that's come up before that has affected North Carolina is Ernesto. Back in 2006, Ernesto came up the coastline and produced quite a bit of rainfall down at the southern part of the coast. 14, 15 inches of rain fell in the Wilmington area, and you can see that left behind some flooded roads in its wake. But Ernesto was not quite damaging enough to warrant its retirement. So it has stayed on the list, and now we're dealing with it again here in 2024. And now there's one new name on this year's list, which is Francine. This was actually the replacement for Hurricane Florence after it was retired in 2018. But when I first looked at the list of the storm names this year, I saw Francine and kind of had a chill up my spine because the name reminded me a lot of Fran and of Francis. Both of those very damaging, very impactful storms in North Carolina. And again, this is kind of the legacy of Florence, the name that replaced it on the list. So I dare say if Francine comes anywhere close to North Carolina, a lot of folks are going to remember those F storms that came before it because it certainly sounds the part of a damaging storm like those had been. One more name that I'll point out that may be familiar is Isaac. This had impacts back in 2012, but not in North Carolina. It was actually along the Gulf Coast, especially in Louisiana. It was a pretty strong and a pretty damaging storm, then more than 40 fatalities in that event, but it just didn't quite meet the World Meteorological Organization's benchmark for retirement. So they've kept it on the list. I mainly mention that because there were storms like that that have affected North Carolina that have not been retired either. Bertha is a really good example. It was the predecessor of Fran in the 1996 season, did a lot of damage at the southern coast. My own thought is that because Fran was even worse than Bertha, that's why they retired Fran, but not both of them. But again, you'll still see Bertha come up in these lists every 6 years. So let's say it is an active season, just like the forecast is showing, and we make it through all 21 of these names. Well, what happens next? So as we've seen in 2005 and then most recently in 2020, the standard practice had always been then you go to the Greek alphabet. So you would have alpha and beta and gamma and so on. And in 2020, we made it 9 Greek letters into their alphabet. One of those in November was Eta, like we talked about, that was a pretty damaging and flooding storm in North Carolina, but also did quite a bit of damage over Central America. So after that season, they decided that a storm like Eta was bad enough to have its name retired. The question came up, can you retire a Greek letter? And there was a lot of uncertainty and controversy about that. So what the World Meteorological Organization decided is let's scrap the Greek alphabet. And instead, starting in 2021, they came up with this supplemental list of more standard names, not your Greek letters. So potentially we could get into this name list this year. If we make it through William, the next name up will be Adria. This supplemental list does not rotate from year to year. The only changes they would make is if one of these names is bad enough that it could be retired, they would replace it. But we have not seen any of these names yet. I think there's a decent chance that they could come up here in 2024. So with that, I will turn it over to Nick with the Weather Service. He will give us the outlook for this year and then some storm preparedness tips.
Okay, thank you so much, Corey. I appreciate that. Let me go ahead and share my screen, and I'll assume everybody can see my screen unless somebody tells me otherwise. But thank you again for the opportunity to be here with you all today. And I want to talk a little bit about, well, first off, to follow up with some of Corey's discussion about the water temperatures, kind of just jumping right into that. Now we saw the plot of the water temperatures that Corey showed. This kind of puts some context in terms of two particular areas that we focus on when it comes to water temperatures. And the first one, starting in the Pacific, we're looking at water temperature anomalies currently that show the El Nino Southern Oscillation neutral conditions at this time. But that cooling trend is expected to continue as we head through the summer months, with La Nina conditions expected to develop during the next couple months. So that first area I highlight there in the Pacific is of concern because we're heading into La Nina conditions, cooler than normal in the equatorial Pacific region. The other region that we're keeping a close eye on is the well above normal water temperatures, again, that Corey pointed out, that exist across the tropical Atlantic basin's main development region for tropical cyclones. So the areas I've circled there in the black boxes, that's generally where we expect to see tropical cyclones develop. So when you see those above normal temperatures, that is cause for concern because certainly tropical cyclones feed off the warm water, and the warmer the water, the more energy those storms have to utilize to become strong storms. So those are two factors right there alone that cause concern. Taking a closer look at El Nino versus La Nina, on the left, you could see the El Nino conditions where the water is warmer in the equatorial Pacific region, warmer than usual. And that typically results in an enhanced subtropical jet stream anchored across southern North America, as you could see there towards the bottom left. A subtropical jet anchored further south that extends into the tropical season tends to shear them, weaken, or even prevent, in some cases, tropical cyclones from developing in the Atlantic Basin. So that's El Nino conditions. During La Nina conditions, the water temperatures in the equatorial Pacific region are cooler than normal and usually result in a weather pattern that features the jet stream displaced farther north across North America, as you see in the lower right. A jet stream that's anchored farther north tends to provide favorable mid and upper level environment over the tropics for tropical cyclones to form and strengthen. Little or no shear is referred to. When you combine the fact that there's very little shear over that main developed region, and I'll back up one slide here, where the water temperatures are running well above normal. Well, those two features really bode for what could be a busy and particularly strong tropical Atlantic season. So with that said, NOAA's official seasonal forecast for the tropical season in the Atlantic Basin, which just came out yesterday, predicts above normal 2024 Atlantic hurricane season with La Nina and warmer than average ocean temperatures, the main drivers of that tropical activity in that forecast. So the two items I just laid out on the previous screens. So in terms of the numbers, and remember, it only takes one. So regardless of the numbers here, we always need to prepare anyway, every season. But you can see the average number of named storms in a typical season is 14, where the NOAA's prediction for this year is 17 to 25. So quite a busy season is expected. And that's the part of the official forecast from NOAA. In terms of how many of those named storms, remember a tropical storm, which is the just below the hurricane stage, gets a name, right? So of those named storms, how many of those will actually make it to hurricane strength? And the prediction is for 8 to 13 when the average is 7. Now, of course, when you reach category 3 on the Saffir-Simpson scale winds, that makes it a major hurricane. And the expectation is 4 to 7 compared to a normal or average season of 3. So also keep in mind, the word major as it relates to major hurricane is just a wind forecast. Remember, any strength of a tropical cyclone can result in major flooding, especially if it's slow moving or maybe the repetitive one storm after another. So I bet you a lot of folks who were flooded out by Floyd, by Matthew, by Florence would consider those major hurricanes in their lives, but they weren't technical major hurricanes on the Saffir-Simpson scale because they have to reach category 3 or higher specifically wind, to be called a major hurricane. So just wanted to point that out, but anyway, as you can see on the probability, the left side of this graphic kind of conveys the confidence. How confident are we that it's going to be above normal season? And the probability for an above normal season is 85%. I mean, that's pretty high. That's pretty high confidence, with only a 5% likelihood that it'll be below normal. So yeah, confidence is way up there in terms of it being a busy season. Okay, so what should we do? What should we do now? Again, remember, even if the numbers on the previous screen showed normal or even below normal, it only takes one storm. So we need to take action. When? Take action today. Don't wait until the storm is making its approach at us before we get ready. Now, we have a variety of themes that we want to focus on, and there's particularly 7 themes we really try to get folks to pay attention to. And the first one is knowing your risk. What is the typical things that have happened during previous tropical cyclones, where I live, where I work, where I go to school? So we want to consider our threats. Are we in storm surge zone? Has it flooded? Have the rivers flooded near my home, school, or work during previous tropical cyclone events? Remember, tornadoes and rip currents are also threats. So if you do live in a flood-prone area, if you're in storm surge zone at the coast, or if you live in an area where streams or rivers near your home or business have flooded, determine that. Figure out, if you're new to the area, ask folks who've been here a while, has it flooded here before? If you're in a storm surge zone, you need to know your zone. North Carolina now calls for evacuations based on zones. So make sure you figure out your zone. Finally, do you have any risks at your actual home or structure? There's, as you see there, mobile homes and basements can be particularly vulnerable. Now, the next thing is to prepare. And think about this now on particularly before we really get into the peak of the season. Make sure you have a plan. You have your supplies that you'll need. Make sure your insurance adequately covers storm damage. Maybe consider flood insurance. Create a plan for your family, which includes how to get in touch with each other during the storm should folks maybe go different ways in terms of where you're seeking shelter. And then finally, strengthen your home. And what does that mean? That means look around your property. Do you have any trees that are weakened, or maybe dead trees that are at risk of falling over during high winds, falling over onto your home? If that's the case, maybe consider removing those dead trees around your home. So that's what we mean about that. You also need to, another theme is understanding the forecast information. You want to make sure that you have reliable sources of weather information as the tropics are getting going, and even on a daily basis. Make sure you rely on, well-known, for sources of weather, maybe instead of just some random Facebook page that might be hyping something up because they want hits or likes. So make sure you rely on National Hurricane Center data, National Weather Service data, and forecasts when it comes to tropical storms and hurricanes affecting us. Know the differences between watches and warning. Remember, a watch means conditions are possible, where a warning means we need to take action now to protect lives and property. Focus on impacts, and remember, regardless of the storm category or the size, we can still have dramatic impacts, even with tropical storms. It may not even be hurricane force, but if it's a very heavy rainmaker or slow moving, or maybe we've had multiple storms affect our area, in a couple given weeks, remember, it's not always about the size of the storm or the intensity. Even weak storms can cause dramatic flooding and damage. Okay, and then finally, this one I really have to emphasize a lot is that don't just focus on the cone. The cone only talks about where the center of the storm is most likely to go. Remember, impacts occur well away and outside of the forecast cone. Now, get moving when the storm threatens, when a storm is actually approaching, when we're a couple of days out. Make sure your home is prepared, window covering, or getting ready to move out of a storm surge zone. Know where you're going to find shelter. Consider your pets. Make sure you have a go bag, the stuff that you would need to either ride out the storm or take with you if you do evacuate. And remember, you might be ready, but your neighbors or friends and families, maybe elderly folks and other vulnerable populations might struggle with this. So be sure to help others in your community. And then finally, follow those orders that are given by local emergency services. If there's evacuation orders, don't take those lightly. It's always best to seek that shelter to evacuate, particularly, again, if you live in a flood-prone or storm surge area. Now, during the storm, when the storm is actually affecting us, stay in your safe place. Don't go outside. Have a way to get those weather alerts that we talked about. Keep in mind that impacts can and are typically felt even far away from the coast. It's not just a coastal thing. And folks who've been here in the central and even western part of North Carolina know that from previous storms. Even in the western part of the state, flooding, flash flooding, landslides are a hazard during tropical cyclones. So the entire state can have risks from tropical storms and hurricanes. And remember, avoid travel. That's the best way. Just stay home, stay sheltered, stay safe. And unless, of course, avoid travel unless you're ordered to evacuate. Now, after the storm has passed, the hazards haven't ended yet, because there's cleanup, maybe there's lingering floodwaters, and a lot of the injuries and fatalities associated with tropical cyclones oftentimes occur after the storm when people are cleaning up. and maybe, we want to avoid injuries when cleaning up. We want to avoid hazards that may be in the water, unseen hazards. So don't go through floodwaters. Remain vigilant for hazards like down power lines, floodwaters. What about if your power's out? Do you know how to safely use your generator? Make sure you learn about generator safety, and make sure you have that generator or any other sources of power, or maybe cooking devices like gas grills or charcoal grills well away from your home to avoid carbon monoxide poisoning. And remember, communication may not be available for some time. Even cell phone networks can go down during in the wake of a tropical storm or hurricane. Finally, let's just kind of wrap up these precautions. Let's button this all up by, number one, determining your risk. Begin to prepare now. Learn how to understand the forecast and what the alerts mean, and learn what to do before, during, and after a storm. If you could take all these precautions and tips, I'm sure we can make it through this hurricane season, no matter what it throws at us. Okay. Last thing I want to remind you about when it comes to tropical storms and hurricanes is that rip currents is the number of fatalities and injuries due to rip currents is really has started to increase dramatically here in the last couple of years. In the days leading up to storms and hurricanes and tropical storms, and even after. Remember, even when the storm is way out to sea, it may not even be a day or two away. It might be way out in the middle of the Atlantic. And remember, those swells that come to the coast due to distant hurricanes can result in deadly rip currents and strong waves. So the hurricane season, whether there's one a day or two away from our coast, or whether if there's one way out in the Atlantic, they will result in dangerous, deadly rip currents, okay, and strong waves. Never assume the ocean is safe. Even if the weather's nice, it's not unusual for the weather to be really beautiful a day or two before the hurricane makes landfall in North Carolina. So remember, the danger is there with rip currents. So make sure if you are at the beach, anytime there's a tropical cyclone, anytime there's one near, one far, or anytime you're at the beach, swim near a lifeguard. And check out the forecast for rip current likelihood at weather.gov/beach. And then remember, this is a message that we want to share all across the state, even well away from the coast. You might be thinking, well, why do I have to, message rip current safety when I live in the western part of the state? Or why do I have to worry about messaging rip current safety when we're here in central North Carolina? The reason is because most of the fatalities, a large percentage of the fatalities in the last 20 plus years that have occurred at the North Carolina beaches, they were folks that lived away from the beach. Only a small percentage, about 20% of the rip current fatalities happened among folks who lived near the beach. The rest, the other 80%, were basically people who lived far away from the beach. So it's important to message rip current safety no matter where you live. Okay, so wrapping this up, I want to talk a little bit about some product updates from the National Hurricane Center. Remember, if you want to get anything from the Hurricane Center, it's an easy website to remember, hurricanes.gov. And these are changes for the 2024 season. There's 8 of them or so here, but the 2 I really want to talk about, I think that are probably most likely, really, we're going to see the most impact from these changes, these really beneficial changes, is number one, in the past, our office in San Juan has done a lot of the translation to Spanish. Of course, here in North Carolina, we have a huge Spanish speaking population. So, now instead of just one forecast office doing all the translations, now we have new AI driven translation techniques that will make it more sort of automated and readily available. So there's some examples there at weather.gov/translate where you could see some of the languages that these messages will be available. But certainly, if you or you have someone who's in a live or resident, or you work with, or you interact with folks who are Spanish speakers, definitely remind folks that all of our text products as it relates to hurricanes will be available in Spanish this year. The other big change I want to talk about, and this is really important because, a lot of folks have gotten used to the idea that if I'm not in the cone, that I don't have anything to worry about. And we're trying to change that mentality that you don't have to be in the cone to see impacts. of course, people in the cone are likely to see impacts, but people even well away from the cone are likely to see impacts as well. So here's what we're used to when the cone. Okay, this is what we've been doing for years, where we show the forecast cone, and remember that cone only shows where the center of the storm is likely to go. We show the cone, and then we've typically showed where along the coast watches and warnings are located, right? So unfortunately, a lot of folks would think, hey, I'm not in the cone, not a big deal. I don't have to worry about it. That is rarely the case. In fact, almost always impacts are well away from the cone. So now what we're going to do on the right side is we're going to display the watches and warnings over inland locations as well. And what that will help convey is how far away those impacts can be felt away from the cone. So, if you're not in the cone, but you're in a warning area, well, then that's helpful information, right? Because that tells folks that, hey, I may not be in the cone, but I'm still in a warned area for whether it's flood warning or wind warning or whatever the warning may be. Placing those warnings and watches on top of the cone, even over inland areas, we think will be really beneficial. And here's another example from Hurricane Florence back in 2018. Several days before landfall, 5 a.m. on that Thursday, if you were in, say, Pitt County, North Carolina, would you think you would have had something to worry about? You may not have, or if you were up in, say, Warren County, North Carolina, you might say, hey, I'm away from the cone. I don't have anything to worry about. Or if you were in, say, the southern coastal plain, you might say, hey, the cone's well to the south. I don't have to worry. Well, now that we're showing the watches and warnings on top of the cone, even for inland locations, that helps better convey that the risk is away from the cone as well. So again, using that Pitt County example, you may not have been in the cone a few days before landfall, but if you would have saw, hey, I'm in a watch, I'm in a tropical storm watch, I need to take this seriously, even though I'm away from the cone. That's what we're trying to do here with these new watches and warnings on the cone. Now, unfortunately, this will not be available until mid-August. Okay, so there's still some setup that needs to be done in configuration of systems. But the bottom line is, we may not have this available for the early season storms, but by mid-August, by the peak of the season, we'll be displaying these products, and it will better convey wind hazard risk again away from the cone. So anyway, we're looking for feedback, comments during this experimental period, and we certainly would love to hear what you think about these as we go through the hurricane season. So this I think, is going to be a big improvement, letting folks know, hey, I don't have to be in the cone to be in the warned area as it relates to wind. So anyway, big improvement there. Again, just want to plug a couple websites. Hurricanes.gov will take you to the National Hurricane Center, where I just did a screen capture 2 days ago, and you can kind of see, there's the top of the page on the left side and the bottom of half of the page on the right. And if there were tropical storms or hurricane watches or warnings in effect, you would see that. Say if they were in the Atlantic, you would see them listed out in these nice little thumbnail graphics across the top. But even outside of times when there are tropical cyclone watches or warnings, if you go to hurricanes.gov, you could still get a sense for what's happening in the next 2 to 7 days. We include our tropical weather outlooks as a first stop right there at the top of hurricanes.gov. There's all kinds of other information, such as the prediction for the season, safety information, and other news items I think you'll find really useful. So check it out, hurricanes.gov. That's easy to remember. Easy website. The other place I want to point you to is weather.gov/Raleigh/tropical. If you're in central North Carolina, but this is the case at all of our neighboring offices. There are 7 National Weather Service offices that serve a part of North Carolina. So if you are, say, down in Wilmington, for example, you go to weather.gov/Wilmington/tropical. Or if you were in Morehead Cities area, weather.gov/MHX/tropical. If you're familiar with your weather service forecast area that covers your part of the state, go to their main page, just add tropical to the end of that, or scroll down to the bottom and you'll see a little hurricane icon where you can click on. That's a one-stop shop that will feature all of the stuff on hurricanes.gov plus local information as well. So whenever the tropical storm or hurricanes are threatening our coast or threatening our state, Even if they're just remnant storms that made landfall on the Gulf Coast and are kind of recurving up and giving us the remnants, anytime there's a tropical cyclone threat for North Carolina, this is a great resource, a one-stop shop for threats and impacts, for the hazard graphics, for satellite radar, preparedness information. It's got everything all in one stop. So anyway, be sure to check that out. And again, the easiest way to get to it simply is just weather.gov. Go to weather.gov, click on North Carolina, and then click on the little hurricane icon down towards the bottom half of the page, and that'll take you to the one-stop shop. All right. So with that, this is my last slide. I just wanted to kind of just put it all back to the human element, right? Here's a look inside of our office here at the Raleigh forecast office. And we have a great team of forecasters who are looking out for you, who are working tirelessly to deliver that weather watch warning and advisory information, working tirelessly to deliver briefings so that you can be informed, working tirelessly, working with our media partners so that our media partners can help convey that information as well. We're here 24/7, 365. And I certainly want to just encourage you to reach out, give us a call anytime you have a question, a concern. There's our office email address, nws.raleigh@noaa.gov. There's my email address, nicholas.petro@noaa.gov, our phone number, and definitely be sure to check us out on social media. Tons of great resources at NWS Raleigh. So with that, I'll turn it back, I believe, to either Corey or Kathy to kind of wrap it up. And I'll stop sharing my screen to turn it back to you. Thank you so much for being here today, and for the invitation to be with you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Corey. A lot of information to take in. A very active hurricane season forecasted, but as we were reminded multiple times that it really only takes one here in North Carolina. So some good preparedness tips, and also some new products from the National Weather Service, which are really wonderful and needed. And I look forward to exploring those more. And also in the chat, a lot of our state partners have been dropping some links, emergency management and North Carolina Department of Transportation. So check those out as well. We will send out a blog post at the end of this. It'll be sometime this afternoon with a link to this recording, but you can also subscribe to our blog. We send out monthly updates, much like what Corey did, just a recap of what we know and some of the historical context. And every now and then we'll send out blog posts on events or topics of interest. So we won't spam you, and you can always stop receiving the emails if you feel like they're too much. So we're going to move over to question and answer. And there is one question in the box right now, and I think this one is for Nick. I think this is asking, do you change the forecast throughout the season as the season goes on?
Okay, great question. Thank you so much for that. Yes, there's one update in August. I don't have the exact update date. Unfortunately, we are only notified of when our official outlooks will be released, usually just a week or so beforehand. So I don't have that, but typically it'll be updated in August, and by then we'll have a pretty good sense of what the rest of the season's going to look like. So yeah, great question. Thanks so much, and certainly, yeah, we'll be keeping our eyes on it.
Excellent. So this question says, it sounds like we could have a large number of tropical storms and hurricanes this year, which could be cumulative impacts over the full season if we have multiple storms, especially in our flood-prone areas. So is the state proactively taking actions now to establish shelters, evacuation centers, and where would that information be distributed or shared? Nick, I'm going to toss that to you, but I know there are some folks who are online who can also add some info in the chat.
Okay, so I don't have the direct answer to that question, but I do know that our partners in North Carolina Emergency Management, both at North Carolina Emergency Management, the state level, and at the local levels and the county levels, are working all the time to build plans, to exercise those plans, to practice it. There are plans for sheltering and that sort of thing. While I can't provide the exact details, I would encourage, if there's anyone with the state emergency management or county level, feel free to drop in any relevant information in the chat, I can confidently say that our emergency management partners are obviously taking this very seriously. Always have. North Carolina has always been, history of very active tropical cyclone activity. So I'm certain there's good plans in place. So where to get that information? I'll tell you one good source for information such as sheltering. I think there used to be an app, the Ready NC app. And I'm not sure if it's readync.org, if that's the website, but definitely Google Ready NC, and the latest URL I'm sure will pop up, which will have a lot of that information available.
Thanks, Nick. And I can attest, there's a window behind me and I often see Nick running out to meet with partners all the time. So he's out of the office and connecting with folks like emergency management and some of the county level folks too. Thank you, Bailey, for the link. I'm gonna wait a few more minutes for any other questions. Okay, there's a question. This one is probably for Nick, but Corey, you can weigh in too. Are there any plans to add a category 6 to the scale?
Good question. I've gotten that question several times. So I've heard chatter, but not aware of any active efforts to do that. After every hurricane season, the National Hurricane Center and all of our partners, we all get together and talk about, what could be done, sort of, after action type meetings and that sort of thing. I'm not aware of anything that has come up about that. I'll turn it to Corey if he has any comments. But I just wanted to make sure, so people who may not have chat open, that they see the website, readync.gov. It used to be readync.org, but it's readync.gov. And there was a chat in here that the app has been decommissioned. So just go to readync.gov. So anyway, I'll turn it back to you, Kathy, or Corey, if he has anything to add about Cat 6. But I'm not aware of any imminent changes or efforts like that.
Yeah, I have not heard that anything is, going on at the higher levels that would initiate that. I've also seen analysis that said if you were to add a category 6, based on the gaps between category 4 and 5, there are very, very few historical storms in the Atlantic that would have ever gotten to that strength. And I think one thing that Nick talked about is that so often I think we overemphasize the category of a storm and base our plans or base the potential impacts around how strong the winds are. Well, North Carolina is case in point that is not always true. We've seen so much flooding, so much damage from technically weaker storms. So I would not personally be a fan of adding another category, because I think it would continue to add to this perception that it's only about the wind speeds, when we know, if anything, it's going the other direction.
Yeah, you both make the points I would have made on that. So thank you for that. Any comments on rapid intensification of hurricanes? I'll toss this to Nick.
Okay, so yeah, that is something that the National Hurricane Center and our research division is working a lot on, to try to model rapid intensification. There's some really great high resolution mesoscale modeling efforts underway. But I'll tell you, one of the main ingredients is hot water, and that water is hot. So certainly, I think if there was an opportunity, that combined with the lack of wind shear, that always are the first two things I look at for intensification, whether it's rapid or otherwise. But certainly intensification, and back to the forecast that NOAA issued. That's why the numbers for major hurricanes are high, because of the conditions are ripe for that. Hot water, low shear, and oftentimes that can lead to rapid intensifications. Would you like for me to just jump down to that last question about tropical systems that come up from the Gulf versus Atlantic?
Sure, go for it.
Yeah. So one thing I always tell folks is it's hard for us to get away a year without anything, because we're always looking not only at the direct strike, like, what's the worst? Like, I always think of Fran as being like the benchmark for a storm that makes a direct run at us, brings storm surge, brings dangerous winds, the whole gamut of impacts. But we also have to always be on the watch for storms down in the Gulf of Mexico, because when they turn north, oftentimes we're in the path of the remnant range. So are there any specific risks for tropical systems that come up from the Gulf? Absolutely. I would say when storms come up from the Gulf, it tends to be more of an impact for the western half of North Carolina, because as it's bringing its remnant rain north, that obviously is first in line, not only with the rain and the moisture being first in line to get the western part of the state first, but also the complex terrain risks, upslope flow that can take that tropical moisture and squeeze it out. So particularly those Gulf storms that move north oftentimes are the ones that really put a major flash flood risk and landslide risk across the western half of the state, and particularly the mountainous region. So we can get it from both directions, and I'm always I'm watching everywhere, not just out in the Atlantic. I'm watching in the Gulf too.
Excellent. We're running out of time, and we're up against lunch and also a 3-day weekend for many folks. So thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us. Have a safe and wonderful and restful holiday. And if you subscribe to our blog, you'll hear from us soon. So thank you again. Thank you, Nick and Corey.
Thank you so much.